Number 79 on our AFI 100 Years, 100 Movies 10th Anniversary Edition list is 1969's The Wild Bunch. The Wild Bunch is a western that walks a fine line. It leans on western tropes and, for its day, forges a lot of new paths. So many movies and many other mediums that would follow would borrow heavily from this classic. The story picks up right after the glory days of the titular gang, the Wild Bunch. The gang's leader, Pike Bishop, played by William Holden, is looking for retirement. Not just for himself, but for anyone who wants to follow. To do so, the gang's looking for one final score. That payday comes from a thrilling heist of silver in a small western town. An ex-member of the gang, Deke Thornton, played by Robert Ryan, knows his old boss so well that he's able to set a trap. The silver's fake, and there's this whole posse waiting for the Wild Bunch in the town. A bloody shootout ensues, many men are lost on both sides of the conflict, and a lot of civilians lose their lives in the crossfire. I don't know who in the town approved a parade on this day, but sure. After discovering the silver is worthless scrap metal, Pike takes the handful of his men that are left and rides to the Mexican border. They attempt to lay low in the hometown of one of the Wild Bunch members. And the gang ends up crossing passes with General Mapache. Mapache, probably saying that wrong, played by Emilio Fernandez, is a movie trope all the way through. The Mexican aspects of his personality are turned up to a cartoon level, and he shouts his dialogue in a way that makes it sound like an impression. Mapache is a brutal general, taking advantage of the villagers to fund his fight against Pancho Villa. Crossing paths with the history in this way gives Pike another shot at that elusive final payday. He agrees that the gang will steal a cache of weapons from the U.S. Army. This heist happens, of course, on a moving train. Sam Peckinpah directed this western staple and co-wrote the script with Wallen Green. It just so happens that Green also wrote a remake that is currently in pre-production. The Wild Bunch was a passion project for Peckinpah. He wanted to deliver a real story about real characters. The plan was to give the audience a feel for the gritty characters of the Wild West. He wanted to put aside the white-hat hero and black-clad villain strolling into a saloon covered in bling. Peckinpah was a fan of the history of the Wild West, not so much the Hollywoodized genre. He and Green both felt there was enough information out there to say that these Western icons didn't do things in a squeaky clean, squared-off and proper way. They fought. And they fought dirty. They shot people. They murdered. Civilians didn't matter. At the end of the day, it seemed that it was every man for himself. There is a lot of shooting in the Wild Bunch. These scenes are not violence for the sake of violence, but are just one more tool Peckinpah used to make the audience feel the Wild West. The action is done as realistically as the director could manage. He went out and fired real guns. He had his effect team fire real guns. He wanted them to know what it felt like and sounded like. He matched the results using whatever he could on the screen. Of course, he didn't actually shoot people, but in one specific instance, the effect of bullets that had missed their mark didn't look authentic enough. Right there on set, Peckinpah grabbed a real revolver with live ammo and emptied it into a wall. He told his production team that is how he wanted things to look and feel. Peckinpah's demand for realism broke ground in Hollywood. He changed the sound effects based on each individual weapon used. Well, today's standards, this kind of seems like a no-brainer, even though we still use incredibly distorted and enhanced sound effects for gunfire in most productions. But prior to Peckinpah's move on this, every single Warner Brothers movie produced the exact same sound effect for gunfire. How incredibly lazy. The Wild Bunch, because of Peckinpah's drive for realism, is often credited, or blamed, depending on who you ask, for the use of violence in modern movie making. This also changed the way the MPAA rates movies and how the very Western genre was handled going forward. As serious as this movie is and how serious Peckinpah was about it, he was not a guy without a sense of humor. Like many ensemble cast movies, egos eventually got in the way. Robert Ryan complained so much about not receiving top billing that when Peckinpah was designing the opening credit sequence, he gave most of the actors a freeze frame of their faces. Ryan got a freeze frame of a bunch of horses' asses. Sam Peckinpah also got a good one over on the main studio that backed the film, Warner Brothers. The gang does some relaxing when in Mexico. They spend time flirting with a lot of women who were clearly paid for their company. These women were actually prostitutes in real life. Peckinpah cast them so he could tell people that Warner Brothers paid for hookers for his cast. Back to the movie itself, another trend that The Wild Bunch helped establish was in the way that it was shot and edited. Creative angles, multi-camera setups, and insanely quick cutting dispersed with fast and slowed down film were revolutionary in 1969. Especially when you think about the analog editing equipment the production team would have had access to. Editor Lou Lombardo claims that the original theatrical release of the movie has over 3,600 cuts. That is the most in any Technicolor film ever produced. Some of them are only a few frames, but to Peckinpah and Lombardo, they made all the difference. The script was clearly well written. Time has been proving that for 50 years. A couple of the biggest moments in the movie, however, were completely unscripted. The climactic train robbery itself was actually improvised entirely on the day. Likely multiple days, that they shot it over. There's also a great character moment toward the end where the gang rallies to help another member. I don't want to say too much and give away a massive plot point at the tail end of the movie, but you'll know it. It's got some of the most emotional resonance in the film. The realism found in The Wild Bunch is why the movie holds up to this very day. At the time, it was a major controversy for its portrayal of brutal violence and a bunch of leads that couldn't even be considered anti-heroes. The men we spend the whole movie with are not heroic. They never claim to be. They aren't even good men forced into a bad situation. They're outlaws through and through. They survive through any means necessary and don't really care who gets caught in the middle. All that doesn't mean we don't care about their plight. One thing I struggled with for most of the duration of the movie, even though I was enjoying what I was seeing on screen as it happened, I had no form of emotional attachments to the characters themselves. But this kind of changed slowly and even snuck up on me. By the end of the movie, you feel for them. It actually came across me like a realization as the runtime dwindled down. It took me by surprise that I found the time to care. The studio and Peckinpah butted heads. If you look at this production, you'll see this as a common theme. There are actually books, multiple, written around Peckinpah and the making of this movie. Peckinpah was over budget and way over time. The studio pestered him so much to see the movie, that he was still cutting in Mexico, that he sat them down for an 8-hour version of it. Of course, the executives weren't happy, but Peckinpah put his team under strict orders not to cut a single frame without his explicit say-so. The budget for this movie ultimately ended up being $6.2 million. I'm unsure of what the budget was supposed to be, but this definitely surpassed it, and from what I'm reading, by quite a bit. It opened only $39,000 and would go on to gross a mere $638,000. After many versions shown throughout the world and a re-release in 1995, the movie is said to have eventually grossed $11 million. That's quite a long time to get your return on investment. It was nominated for 2 Oscars, one for screenplay and one for score, but it didn't take home either. The success of The Wild Bunch isn't the finances or in its awards at the time. The movie revolutionized the genre, the studio, and how movies as a whole were made since its debut. It was underappreciated in its day, but has stood the test of time. It's one that didn't grab me right away, but by the end I was invested. It does run a little long, but the impressive elements that it contributed to the industry we all love speaks for themselves. That's going to do it for 1969's The Wild Bunch. Thanks for watching. Be sure to come back next week for number 78, a Charlie Chaplin classic, Modern Times from 1936. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Subscriptions really help us grow our audience. The AFI Countdown videos hit a week early for our patrons on Patreon. Tiers start at only $1 a month, and you get multiple monthly bonus shows for it. Be sure to listen to So Wizard Podcast every single week wherever you get your podcasts. SoWizardPodcast.com is your resource for reviews, recommendations, videos, merchandise, and more. We love hearing feedback, so drop us a note in the comments or leave us something on social media. All of our accounts can be found after the show and in the show notes. Thanks again.